You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I'm going to dive into the whole subject of how healing happens. One of the questions that I've wrestled with professionally, but far more personally, is how exactly does healing happen? What is involved in the process of change and growth? This, of course, is too large a topic to tackle in a couple of podcast episodes, but I want to at least identify some of the core elements that are necessary for healing. In other words, if you are going to experience healing, if you are going to grow and mature, what will be required of you? In answering that question, we are going to look at an extremely helpful tool known as the U diagram, It was created and developed by Kathy Loerzel. Kathy is the executive vice president of the Allender Center, where I learned much of what I talk about on this podcast. And over the course of the next 3 episodes, we are going to let Kathy's U diagram be our guiding illustration. I think you'll find it incredibly helpful, as I have. But before we get started, if you find this podcast beneficial, would you consider supporting it financially? There are a lot of expenses associated with producing it, and you can help fund the podcast by going to adamyoungcounseling.com and clicking on support the podcast. Okay, let's dive into the question of how healing happens. The first thing that is necessary for healing is you have to allow your heart, your mind, and your body to ponder and engage what it was like for you in your family of origin. There is no way to experience healing apart from taking an honest look at those stories from your growing up years that hold intense feelings. Those feelings might be shame, powerlessness, sexual arousal, terror, ambivalence, a sense of betrayal. You have experienced something of all of these feelings. The invitation is, will you step into stories that hold big feelings for you? What are 1 or 2 of the stories of your life that when you think about what happened, things move around in your stomach, or your chest tightens, or you just get this sensations in your body that let you know that this story holds weight for your body? Your body will take you to the stories you need to engage. Now, if you are willing to enter a story of harm, a story of tragedy, a story of abuse, you're inevitably going to find yourself feeling things that you would rather not feel, which, of course, is why we tend to avoid these stories for decades. One prerequisite to healing and growth is engaging the emotions and the bodily sensations that arise as you ponder and reflect on some of the more painful stories of your life. And indeed, to feel these feelings will be like experiencing a sort of death. I don't know how you engage the more painful stories of your life without a part of you dying. So why in the world would anyone do this? Well, it is the pattern seen in the life of Jesus, and it is the pattern into which Jesus calls each one of us. The core of the Christian narrative is contained in 3 days: Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Jesus was crucified on a Friday. He was tortured and traumatized. On Sunday, he was resurrected. Despite the trauma and abuse of Friday, resurrection on Sunday holds and held deep joy and hope. In order to get from Friday to Sunday, Jesus had to experience the hell of Saturday. What was true for Jesus is true for us. There is no way to get from Friday to Sunday without going through the hell of Saturday, without dipping down into the valley of the shadow of death. The Old Testament repeatedly uses 3 metaphors to describe the Saturday experience. It talks about the wilderness, the desert, and the valley. Saturday is about the wilderness. It's about the desert. It's about being in the valley. Imagine a piece of paper in your mind. Now, imagine starting in the upper left corner of the paper and drawing a diagram of a valley. You slope down to the bottom of the page, and then you slope back up to the upper right-hand corner of the page. And in the end, it looks like a kind of U. This is known as the U diagram, and it is one of the many gifts that I have received from completing what's called the certificate program at the Allender Center. In fact, a lot of what I'm about to say today, I first learned at the Allender Center, and you can check out their offerings at theallendercenter.org. I highly recommend the certificate program or the story workshop if you are interested in engaging your story at a deeper level. So the trajectory that you traced with this U is a helpful way of talking about the trajectory of healing. And we're going to use it to talk about and to image how healing happens. Today's episode is devoted to the first half of the U, and it's devoted to common ways that we try to escape entering into the U. And then in the next episode, I'll focus on what happens as a result of entering and moving through this U to the other side. So here's why the U diagram is very important. For the traumatized person, the pattern of the Christian life is this: revisiting trauma, i.e. the crucifixion of Friday, upper left-hand corner of the paper, leads to hell, bottom of the paper in the middle, the descent of Saturday, which ends in joy, upper right-hand portion of the paper, the resurrection of Sunday. Kindly entering our stories of trauma and heartache will lead us through hell and ultimately to joy. So you have to dip down. Now, what we want to do is to dance on a little dotted line that goes straight across the top of the page from Friday to Sunday. We want to fly right across from Friday to Sunday so that we don't have to dip down into the death of the wilderness, the valley, the desert. Here's the problem with that. There is no way to get to joy and rest without going through the valley of the shadow of death. You can get to denial and a superficial sense of being better, but not healing and genuine joy. There is no dotted line. There is no way to skip over the depths. You can't dance your way gleefully from Friday to Sunday. Now, by the same token, as long as you let yourself slide down the slope, as long as you are faithful to enter death, you will inevitably be surprised as you find joy in life. Resurrection will begin to truly exist for you. So, where is the place we find ourselves? We find ourselves through the process of entering death. There is no way to find yourself. That is, to find out who you are and to be at rest with who you are and joyful about who you are and the story that has played a role in the creation of who you are, apart from dipping down to the bottom of the U, dipping down into the desert season where death looms. Now, what does it mean to dip down to the bottom of the U? What does it mean to enter death? It requires several things, but here's the first. Entering death requires that you engage particular scenes of heartache, tragedy, abuse, harm. It can be difficult to move from the telling of a story that is general to telling a story with sensory detail on the ground level. To tell a story on the ground level is to tell a particular narrative, to paint a picture, a scene within your overarching story. So, for example, suppose a woman says to you, "I was sexually abused by my stepfather. It happened for 6 years, usually in my bedroom in the morning before he went to work." Has she told you a story? Well, yes and no, but mostly no. She's told it at 30,000 feet. She has told it in a way that keeps her not in no ways totally safe, but relatively safe from really the core wars of her heart that will send her to the bottom of the U, that will send her into something that feels like death. The reason that we tend to tell stories at 30,000 feet is because it is uncomfortable to enter into the details of a scene. Sometimes telling the story at 30,000 feet is all we have the courage for in the moment, and that is a good start. But when we begin to tell a story at the ground level with details, we will begin to feel the emotions and the bodily sensations that we felt in the original story. So, point number 1, you have to enter particular scenes because you need to feel the emotions and the bodily sensations that you originally felt, or you didn't feel because it wasn't safe to and there was no space for your emotions. Now, point number 2, we must linger there. We must linger there. It is not enough to stick your toe in the water and pull it right back out again. We have to linger in death for a time. How long? Usually a few moments longer than we're comfortable with. To start with, that might be 30 to 60 seconds. But as we experience the taste of joy and hope that results, we are able to linger longer. To linger in death means to let the big emotions associated with particular scenes in your story rise to the surface. They are there even when we don't know they are. And those feelings are actually sapping you of a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of freedom. So why not let them rise to the surface? This means spending time in the moment when you were betrayed by someone who should have protected you and cared for you. It means lingering with, sitting with the part of the story when you felt absolute powerlessness and noticing the sensations that powerlessness evokes in your body now, in the present, the emotions that are triggered in the present as you reflect on the story, as you step into it. The part of the story where you realize that if you resisted the abuse, he wouldn't talk to you for 3 days. And since he was the only goodness in your world, that was unbearable. Now you have a sense of your bind. Now you have feelings in your body that will feel unbearable. To linger in death is to sit in the particular moments of shame, of betrayal, of powerlessness, of ambivalence that have marked your life. It is to sit in them and to feel deeply uncomfortable emotions like hopelessness, despair, sorrow, rage. I don't know what it will be for you, but it will be among these. To linger in death is not merely cognitively reflecting on a traumatic scene. It requires that, but it's entering the scene limbically, which simply means with your emotions and your bodily sensations. What's fascinating about the U diagram is that the descent is what, the U, it's a metaphor. The descent is a metaphor, but the descent is what literally happens in the brain when you feel intense emotions like fear, shame, and rage. The areas of your brain that are activated when you dip down into the bottom of the U and begin to feel these painful emotions, those areas of your brain are located at the lower portion of your brain, the limbic brain. And the cortical brain, which is the place where you think, where rational thought kind of resides, that's at the top of your brain. So literally, descending into your emotions is what actually happens in terms of the neural architecture of your brain. Now, how do you know if you are entering a specific story on the ground level rather than keeping a safe distance from the details of the story? A good story has setting, it has character, it has plot. In the previous example that I shared, all we know about the setting is that the abuse occurred in her bedroom. She has not told you the color of the bedspread, or the carpet, or the wallpaper. She has not told you that they would often do a crossword puzzle together. And by the way, I'm making this story up. This isn't a true story. She has not told you that they would often do a crossword puzzle together because her stepfather knew that she loved crossword puzzles. And he would bring her one, and they would do it before he abused her. These are the images that she sees in her mind when she says the simple sentence, "I was sexually abused by my stepfather." All we know about her abuser is that he was her stepfather, but we know nothing of the kind of man that he was. Stories need character development. We don't know that her stepfather was rather kind to her most of the time, and that he protected her from her older brother, and that he often asked her about her art class, which she loved. All we know about the plot is that abuse happened. We don't know when, we don't know what. She has not told you that the cue that it was about to happen was that he would bring either a new crossword puzzle book or the one that they were currently working on. He would bring it in. I mean, even as I say these words, aren't you feeling things in your body that you were not feeling a few minutes ago? Here's the point. To tell a story in a way that allows you to re-enter it is to tell the details. When you're talking about the bedspread, it is a totally different story. Now, let me share another fictional story to illustrate the point. Suppose a woman shares that she was sexually abused by her uncle. She has yet to share any narrative. And we talk for a bit about the difference between a general telling of a story and a ground level telling of a story. And she begins to understand the difference. And then after a long pause, she says, "There was a red-colored windowsill, and there were horses outside my window. I would always look at the horses when he came up the stairs." Now she's in her story. Can't you feel the difference in your body even as I recount it? As soon as she saw the horses outside the window, her body was in the narrative. She was no longer occupying a safe cognitive distance from the emotions that torment her in her day-to-day life. The real wars that rage in your heart can only be accurately named in the context of particular stories. If you hear nothing else, please hear that. The real wars that rage in your heart on a day-to-day basis, they can only be accurately named in the context of particular stories. They were birthed in moments of heartache, in moments of scenes, of incidents. 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 10 minutes. Here's what I mean. Just pay attention to your own body as you listen to her words. I remember seeing the crossword puzzle book folded in his hand as he came into my room. My body would tense up whenever I saw that book. And when he wasn't holding the book, I was devastated. Now you've got a sense of her war. She longed for the goodness of the affection that she got from her stepfather, who was the only person in her world who even cared that she loved doing crosswords. And she longed to be chosen by him again that day. And she hated it because it meant the violation of her body and her heart. That ambivalence is ripping her heart apart. Literally, what we know about trauma is that that level of ambivalence disintegrates neural networks in the brain. It fragments them. It separates them. It rips them apart. It creates fragmentation rather than connectedness. But there's no way to enter and deal with the effects of that ambivalence if it is not presently being felt. And the way to feel it in the here and now is through the telling of the story on the ground level. Now, very important caveat, the risk of re-entering stories of abuse is the risk of re-traumatization. The byproduct of trauma is an unregulated bodily experience, an uncontrollable cascade of strong emotions and physical sensations. Traumatized people frequently experience themselves as being at the mercy of their thoughts, their memories, their sensations, their emotions, because they can't calm and quiet their insides when they begin to feel fear, rage, shame, etc. They get dysregulated. Your internal emotional state, which is constantly in flux, is known as affect or arousal, by which I mean physiological arousal, not right now, not sexual arousal. If you want to hear more about affect, you can listen to episode 20 of the podcast, which is all about affect regulation. But to briefly recap, the term affect refers to the felt sense of what is happening in your body. It ranges from numb and shut down to terrified and panicked. Whenever you are distressed, your affect is dysregulated. Affect is experienced as body sensation. So in the case of moderate arousal, the sensation is a slight feeling of excitement or attentiveness. And that's what I hope you're feeling right now as you're listening. On a scale of 1 to 10, optimal arousal is in the 5 to 6 range. When you go up to the 8 to 10 zone, your body is in a state of hyper arousal. And this is marked by flooding emotions like panic, terror, rage. You often feel a racing heart, a tightening in the chest or the stomach, faster breathing, a sense of jitteriness. Now, conversely, when you go down to the 1 to 3 zone, your body is in a state of hypoarousal, marked by a sense of shame, abandonment, hopeless despair. You often feel numb and just shut down. The term affect regulation refers to your ability to calm yourself when you are hyperaroused and to stimulate yourself, i.e. to come back to life when you are hypoaroused. I say all of that to say this. There is absolutely no value in entering stories of harm if you get so dysregulated that you are overwhelmed by panic or completely shut down and disconnected. Let me say it again. There's no value. Nothing healing can happen in your brain if you enter a story of harm and you get so dysregulated that you pop up to 10 or down to 1. This is why it's so important to have either a trusted friend who has engaged their own trauma or a trauma-trained therapist as you step into these stories, because you need someone to help you stay regulated as you engage very painful stories, oftentimes containing emotions that you have buried and have not felt. Nothing healing can happen when you're dysregulated. Why? Because you're not present. You're no longer present. However, here's the issue. The brain doesn't change at 5 to 6 either. It doesn't change in that middle zone either. And it doesn't change when you're at the extremes. It changes at 4 and 7. The brain changes when we're pushing on the borders of what's called our window of tolerance. The 4 to 7 range is your window of tolerance. The brain changes when we're a little bit panicked and our heart's racing a little as we push up to 7 or 8. Or it changes when we're beginning to go numb and we push down to a 3. That's the zone of change. That's where neural networks get reconfigured. You want to be at the edges of your window of tolerance, but not beyond them. As someone enters death, as they enter a story of harm, they are going to begin to dysregulate. And that is necessary for healing. But if the dysregulation gets too extreme, you lose the ability to be present and you're simply re-traumatized. Now, a second dilemma with entering painful scenes is that when you get close to the main character in the story, namely you might find that your self-contempt goes through the stratosphere. More often than not, our posture toward the younger us in the story is not very kind. In fact, our posture is often flat out violent. It's this sense of he was so needy, or she was such a fool for thinking her grandfather actually cared about her. Or he was such a wimp that he didn't fight back. Or she liked it when her stepdad fondled her. She wanted it. It was exciting. Or simply a posture of, I hate her. I mean, do you hear the violence in those accusations? Entering a story with massive self-contempt can be re-traumatizing rather than healing. Engaging the self-contempt before continuing with the story actually prepares the heart to begin to dip down into the you. So a prerequisite to a redemptive lingering in death, a prerequisite to entering stories of harm in a helpful way, is a growing kindness toward the boy or the girl in the story. I can't emphasize that enough. What is required for healing? A growing kindness towards the boy or the girl in the story. Now, in addition to resisting movement down into the valley, the wilderness, the desert, we also have a tendency to pop up once we find ourselves down there. We have a tendency to short circuit the descent and then the organic rising up on the other side. We have a tendency to short circuit that. We can try to pop up, to pop back up to the top of the U, except we will not find ourselves across the valley. We wind up in the open space between the arms of the U. We try to hop right out of the death that we just touched. What do I mean by popping up? Well, suppose you are sitting with a man who has just shared some of his story with you, and he is presently feeling the severity and the pervasiveness of his mother's criticism of him. He has opened his eyes to seeing a new level of her cruelty, and he is likely feeling some of the pain that cruelty inflicted, and even more, the loss of love, the loss of kindness that he was meant to experience. He's feeling all that. He has dipped down into death. He has dipped right down to the bottom of the U. What happens in that moment? Suddenly, his sorrow vanishes, and he says, "But who am I to judge? I can be critical of my kids also." What is that? That's popping up. It may be a true sentence. I'm sure it's a true sentence, but it is currently being used as a way to escape feeling the weightiness of his sorrow. Now, here's another way to pop up. Suddenly he says, but my mom had a horrible childhood. It was far worse than mine. Again, the sentence may be 100% true, but it is currently being used to pop back up out of the painfulness of the sorrow and grief that he was just a minute ago very connected to. Anytime you compare your story to someone else's, like your mom's, you're popping up out of death and into self-contempt. The bottom of the U is not about feeling bad. It's about feeling your primary emotions, by which I mean grief, sorrow, shame, hurt, and sometimes rage. The Saturday experience has nothing to do with beating yourself up. Beating yourself up, indeed, any form of self-accusation, any form of self-punishment, is actually a way to avoid the bottom of the U. It is a way to avoid grief, sorrow, shame, pain. As long as you are awash in self-contempt, you don't have to feel shame or sorrow or grief. And just as an aside, it needs to be said that if you choose not to enter death, if you choose not to let yourself slide down the U into sorrow and grief, do not think that you are somehow making your life more functional. We carry our deaths around with us, whether we engage them or not. Those deaths are presently weighing you down, and they are rotting your soul from the inside. And as Richard Rohr has so poignantly pointed out, if we don't transform our pain through grief, we will always transmit it. Always, always. There is no way around it. If we don't transform our pain through grief and sorrow, if we don't dip down to the bottom of the U, we will always transmit our pain and hurt others. Here's another way to pop up. It's this simple sentence: if I go there, I'll never come back. If I start crying, I'll never stop. When someone says this to you, they're pleading with you to see them, to see the immensity of their pain. It appears that they have you in a bind because you're inviting them to grief, and they're saying, if I do what you're suggesting, I'll drown. This kind of objection often means that the other person is beginning to take their story more seriously, that they're beginning to try on what would it feel like to go there. And in their body, there's this sense of, if I go there, I might not come back. I might not be able to get up tomorrow morning. And I have kids, I have a job, I have obligations. They're sitting with the pain of their story enough to realize that if I keep feeling this and let myself go there, I may not be able to get up off the ground. They're at the bottom of the U, and then the fear comes rushing in that if they linger there, it might suck them under. But remember, that is precisely the Saturday experience. The Saturday experience is you don't know it's going to be okay. You don't know that you'll stop crying. You don't know that you'll come back from the brink. Now, Christians will often use theology to pop back up. For example, a woman is beginning to really feel the devastation of how her father never pursued her heart, and he really didn't care when she told him about her sexual abuse by a teacher. She's dipping down into death, into the desert, into the sorrow and grief of her father, or the fact that her father didn't give a rip about her, and then suddenly she shifts and she says this, "But I know that I need to forgive him and move on." Now, if you're sitting with this person, what's the bind she's just put you in? It's true, right? She does need to forgive him. But at this moment, she is using that theological conviction as a way to avoid suffering her story. And you can gently name her desire to escape the discomfort of her story and invite her back into the heartache. Invite her to drop back down into the U. Here is another quote-unquote Christian way of popping up. Someone says, the gospel takes care of all this. Jesus has already taken care of sin. We're called to be a hopeful people. It's not necessary for us to dip down to the bottom of the U because of what Jesus has done. What is that? It's an attempt to walk along the dotted line from Friday to Sunday. It's an attempt to avoid sliding down the U into the death of Saturday, into the wilderness of I don't know it's going to be okay, into the sorrow and the grief that is necessary for true healing to begin to occur for you. It suggests a glimpse of the miracle, but it leaves you bereft of the experience of hope that can be ours. And it is fundamentally a denial of the reality of the crucifixion in this life. The Christian is meant to constantly hold together the full reality of both death and resurrection, to enter both deeply, to hold both deeply all the time. Paul's injunction is to mourn with those who mourn and to rejoice with those who rejoice. Resurrection doesn't cancel out the reality of death. In some ways, it does seem to mitigate the death, but we must resist the temptation to let it erase the sorrow of the death. Jesus wept at Lazarus' grave before raising him from the dead, and he knew what he was about to do. That is stunning. How do you make sense of that? Now, there are others of us who are often tempted to let death detract from the reality of resurrection in this life. While resurrection will always be tinged with the death that preceded it, we must embrace the joy and the hope of resurrection. It is a tall order, but as Dan Allender has put it, if you are able to hold both death and resurrection, you are one of the most powerful people in your community. You're certainly one of the most powerful people in your family. The temptation to jump from Friday to Sunday is powerful. And the cognitive justifications for popping up out of our painful emotions are absolutely legion. Here's the point. You have to continually invite yourself and others back into the story. Simply to say, a minute ago, you said, I wish my dad had come to more of my softball games. And when you said that, I felt your sorrow. I felt connected to you. And then we went somewhere else. Did you feel that shift? Most people can feel it when they pop up from the bottom of the U. They can feel it when they dip down into death, into the limbic portion of their brain, and they can feel it when they pop up and go into their cognitive cerebral cortex. We can't avoid death. We can't. And when we try to, it's like moving across this dotted line from Friday to Sunday. Death and grief and sorrow turn out to be really important for healing. You have to move through them in order for this other place called resurrection to start to exist for you. And here's the thesis to set us up for next week. Something beautiful happens when you actually dip down into places of death. I look forward to continuing the conversation next week. Thanks for listening. Music for the podcast was provided by Rob Mathis and Rick Wilson. Thank you both, gentlemen. And please, I said it at the beginning, but just a reminder here at the end, if you're finding the podcast to be helpful for you, please consider supporting it financially. You can do that from my website. See you next week.